Good afternoon. I'm happy to introduce Professor John McRae. I was living in Tokyo and teaching at the Komazawa University, which is a Buddhist university. We're aware that the time 2 o'clock is not so awakening, but we awake, please. And the hero of this presentation of this paper has been described by at least one Chinese as a toothless, ugly, old Indian who came over from India to China to make a lot of confusion in China. That is Bodhidharma. Has been described in so many pictures as a fierce-looking old guy from India. And Professor John McRae was a specialist on Chan Buddhism and has been translating a lot of Chinese texts, especially Chan texts, to English. He's going to touch upon the hagiography of the Bodhidharma, who was supposed to be the founder of Chan Buddhism. Incidentally, I just finished a semester with a seminar on the biographies, hagiographies of Buddhist figures from Buddha on until today, the hagiography, which is online being written on the Dalai Lama of today. So there's a blurred line between hagiography and biography. Are we describing what happened in the life of Bodhidharma and any other figure, or are we creating that? And on this blurred line between hagiography and biography, Professor McRae.
Okay. First of all, can you hear me? I'm not sure that that is going to work. I'd like to. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. So I should put it back where it was, probably. Leave well enough alone. Well, thank you very much first of all, to Professor Raz for introducing me, and of course to my old friends Meir and Yunit for inviting us here. Those of you who were here this morning can recognize both the joy and the torment in my life. In other words, my wife is a hard act to follow. What is happening, or what I'm going to submit you to at the moment is a current stage in my research, dependent on where I happen to be in the studies of the history of Bodhidharma and of early Chon. And if I can get my pointer to work. Oh, I see. I'll start out and tell you where I'm going to end up. What I would like to be able to say, what I've done in the handout, is giving you an integrated narrative of the history of what I call Proto-Chon, which is the period of Chan Buddhism before it really became Chon. That is to say, the men, I think it's almost exclusive, well, later there's one nun involved, but the ascetics, wandering practitioners involved with Bodhidharma and Hui Ke. In talking about this, I'll discuss three of the earliest primary sources and show fairly briefly how what we have with the story of Bodhidharma is a hagiography that evolves radically over time. I mean, there are profound changes in how Bodhidharma is conceived. Now, when Professor Raz is talking about a toothless old foreigner, I thought at first actually he was talking about me. but Bodhidharma does come to be represented, as you'll see, as a fat, furry foreigner, and that actually describes me sometimes fairly well. What I'll be giving you in this presentation is one conclusion that I think is fairly solid, one hypothesis which I think is reasonable but only based on circumstantial evidence, and one, here I call it speculation, that's the fancy word for a wild-ass guess. But I think it goes together fairly well into a plausible historical story. And that, to me, is a good enough goal for reasons that I'll explain. That is to say, even the challenge of telling a kind of a believable narrative sequence about how the hagiography of Bodhidharma came together is an important kind of goal of my research at the moment. So I have very modest goals, in fact, and you'll see all the interesting stuff is at the beginning, that when I get to the end, I have actually, my conclusions to this are actually bordering on what seem like the trivial. So I have, I think, 4 questions that I'd like to answer. Was the Bodhidharma depicted in the earliest source, that is the record of the monasteries of Loyang, was he actually the founder of Chan Buddhism? And I'll explain why that's an issue. And then second, both 2 students of Bodhidharma, or perhaps student and grand student, Hui Ke and Tan Lin, both suffered the amputation of one hand, either by others or by themselves, in Hui Ke's case, according to the story. Why did that happen? How could that have happened? It's an amazingly rare event. I know of no other example in Chinese Buddhist history of a monk having his hand cut off or cutting his hand off himself. And to have 2 monks in the same story is, I don't know how we would calculate the statistical probability of that. And I think I'm on 3 now, that's right. Am I up to 3? Okay, help me when I need that. The most important text associated with Bodhidharma is a text called the Treatise on the 2 Entrances and 4 Practices, which has lots of interesting stuff in it, which I'm just not going to talk about today, because that would be too much fun. But the question I'll deal with really is, when was it written? And I have a theory about that. And finally, a question that I'll address only very, very briefly, very simply. In the earliest, there's a set of biographies of Chinese monks that I translate here as Continued Lives of Eminent Monks, the Xu Dao Zhuang. That says Bodhidharma came from the south, came into China along from the maritime route. And why would it say that? Okay, so the background of this is that I've been teaching the last year at Komazawa University, which is a Soto Zen university in Japan. And I taught this last year a course on the beginnings of Zen. And then I did a series of lectures that they called, this wasn't my idea, the Cradle of Zen. And so this is the extent of my graphics ability here. Then finally they asked me to do some public lectures. All of this is in Japanese, actually. So public lectures on that I did the rediscovering Bodhidharma and the 2 entrances and the 4 practices. So what I'm doing today is basically an English rendition of my Japanese lecture. So now to go way back, this is also, I have a lot of introduction here, actually. We're not halfway through with even the introduction yet. I'm going back to my dissertation. So in doing this class at Komazawa, I had the occasion to go back to my dissertation work, which was a book on the Northern School of Early Chan Buddhism. This book actually, I mistitled it. It would have sold much better. It would have sold at all, I think, if it had been called The Beginnings of Chan Buddhism, something on that order, which is really what it is. It's a history of Chan Buddhism from Bodhidharma up through the Northern School. And the Northern School is a group that loses out in the traditional history of Chan Buddhism if you know the story in the Platform Sutra of the exchange of verses between Huineng and Shanshou. The Northern School is identified with Shanshou, with the losers. So it's a very I don't know how it corresponds in an Israeli cultural context. In an American context, it's rooting for the underdog. Okay? And then my second project, which I've had on my CV, forthcoming the following year for the last 25 years, is the sequel is on the Southern School. And I already have the cover picked out for the Southern School. That's going to be in a gray cover. So I have my own little Civil War series, the North and the South. Anyway, just as I was preparing this, my friend Bernard Faure sent me an article. Just as I was preparing the dissertation for publication, Bernard sent me a pre-publication version of his article, Bodhidharma as Textual and Religious Paradigm. Has anybody read this article? Oh, good. Okay. We're safe. I can say anything now. Okay. So this came out in '86, I think it was, in History of Religions. I call it, it's a revolutionary, it was at the time, a revolutionary application of postmodern structuralist approach to studying religion. It really was a significant work. Bernard this is the only picture I could find of Bernard. There's a little cutout from a larger group picture. He's a very charming guy. I'm going to end up saying some really very critical things of Bernard's article, and I hope that I hope it doesn't sound mean and nasty, because I don't mean it that way. I disagree with him profoundly in certain ways, and I think that I'm disappointed with his work in certain ways, but he has done an incredible amount for the study of Chinese Chon Buddhism and Japanese Zen as well. So please, when I get snotty and small-minded at the end of this talk, overlook it if you would. So Bernard, in this field, he's written quite a bit of other material as well, but his two famous books were originally one manuscript that was divided and made into two books, these two books. And the Bodhidharma article came out also as part of a chapter of the 1993 volume. So what Bernard says in this article is that the original sources for Bodhidharma's biography are incommensurable. They can't be fit together. They're talking about different people. They're fundamentally different sources. So that when modern writers create an image of Bodhidharma, a biographical or hagiographical image, we're doing that through what he calls an illegitimate manipulation of hagiographical images. We're taking these multiple images and for our own convenience, kind of mushing them into one. And so that Bodhidharma's historical identity is therefore unrecoverable. We can't get back to the original historical primal figure. So he argued, Bernard Faure argued effectively, that the study of the history of Bodhidharma was doomed to failure. Damn, that's just what I've done. In fact, in my book, here I quote, I've changed the spelling a little bit, but basically this quotation from the dissertation book. If we were to take the continued biographies of eminent monks literally, the Shikazanjan literally, Bodhidharma arrived in South China by the maritime route in or before the year 479. And if we take Sun Fu's teacher, this is another figure in the biographies, who studies under a guy named Dharma. If we take his teacher as the founder of the Chon school, then we can infer that Bodhidharma had moved to the north by the year 495 because of what it says in Sun Fu's biography, and maybe even earlier than that. And third, if we look at the record of the monasteries of Luoyang, Bodhidharma was still in North China sometime during the years 516 to 526, and probably he stayed in North China afterwards until he died, and that death of Bodhidharma occurred around the year 530. I like to say just before dinner, actually. Sometime between 524 and 534. This is only a slightly revised version of Hu Shi's take of Bodhidharma's history. And it corresponds precisely to, I think that Hu Shi was presumably Bernard's primary target in the article that he'd written. And one of the problems in Hu Shi's work, and in that part of my dissertation as well, is that Hu Shi kind of wants it both ways. He recognizes that the Bodhidharma that's depicted in the record of the monasteries in Luoyang doesn't look like a Chon figure, but yet uses the data in order to argue for the kind of outline of Bodhidharma's hagiography. So, I'm not a total fool. I may have gotten the whole thing wrong, but I know how to protect myself, right? So Bernard sent me this article just in time for me to add the following to the book as it came out. We must bear in mind that these points have a number of unverifiable suppositions that are based on potentially incompatible sources. Although nothing else can be said about Bodhidharma with any historical certainty, perhaps this is only fitting. Without question, the hagiography surrounding Bodhidharma's role as the founder of the Chon tradition is much more important than any historical contribution he may have made. I don't know how profane I should get in this illustrious environment, but this is really chicken-shit scholarship. This is just, defend your rear end sort of scholarship. Although, when I look at this sentence now and I say that the role as the founder of the Chon tradition is more important, it does seem to imply kind of the style of interpretation that I put forward in my more recent book, Seen Through Zen, which came out in 2003, where I talk about the first rule of Zen studies, McRae's first rule of Zen studies is it's not true, and therefore it's more important. That what is important about the Chon tradition is not to put it with the facts. It's not to try to figure out what actually happened. What's important is what people thought about the story. Okay? So if the story of Bodhidharma and Huayke, for example, had been factually, journalistically correct, that would involve two guys. Okay, big deal. But the stories that have been told over and over and over again have been told and retold and recreated and made to evolve by thousands and tens of thousands of potentially so it's not true, and therefore it's more important. This is expressly in contrast to insurers who really want to separate the facts. When we look at Bernard's article, a number of things that we can say about it. It's only 12 pages long. It has a kind of French style of writing. Not that it, the English is fine, but it's like French philosophical writing, where you have to convince the reader of your brilliance by writing sentences that he can't understand. It contains Sanskrit terms, Chinese terms, kind of French human sciences kind of terminology. He cites as canonical methodological sources Dominique Lecapre, Desserteau, Michel Foucault, de Saussure. It's really a kind of mind-boggling morass of the 12 pages. One of my students, I gave this to a freshman class to write, and one of the students very memorably said, "No one has the right to write that way." I don't think I've ever quite told Bernard about that. So if you don't mind, keeping that, among ourselves, I would appreciate it. This year I'm teaching a class at Komazawa on English writings or Zen writings in English, and I can't wait till we get to the end of the academic year and I give them this one. What he does in the article is he presents a structural analysis of Bodhidharma's hagiography. He looks at hagiography as a literary genre, which scholars prior to him had not done. He recognizes hermeneutics as an alternative methodology, but he simply doesn't use it at that point. But he very strongly rejects historical study as something that is indistinguishable, in a sense, from sectarian apologetics. He doesn't use that terminology, but there is a strong sense of disdain in the article. In that context, though, he presents some just really crucially important ideas to the study of modern Chon. One is the notion of the dual, or the duel, I suppose you'd say. Since the word in French means both a shootout and a pair, he takes that ambiguity and uses it very creatively to suggest that when we're looking at biographies of sages, very often we see not an individual figure but we'll see the figure paired with someone else. And in the case of Bodhidharma, Bodhidharma is contrasted with another meditation master named Sung Cho. In many respects, a much more influential, much more influential in his own time figure. And also, Huinan and Shen Shou paired in the Platform Sutra that I mentioned just before. Incidentally, there's an article by a graduate student at Berkeley, Eric Green, that's coming out, or maybe it is out yet, in Tongbao, describing the Bodhidharma Sung Cho material and Dao Xuan's take on meditation. A great, great article. Anyway, Bernard's short piece has really rich content, and it was a great stimulation to the field. And what I hope for, what I think readers hope for from both the 12-page article and his two books, The Rhetoric of Immediacy and Chon, Insight and Oversights, was that this was not merely Bernard manifesting his brilliant analysis of Chon tradition, but his kind of unleashing of a new set of analytical technologies on Chon. And that, I think, has not really happened. I don't really see anybody following in Bernard's footsteps. Wendy Adamek is a very notable exception. She has an excellent, excellent book on later 8th century Chon tradition based on the text of the Lidai Fabaji. Bernard himself describes the creation of hagiography with a metaphor of mortuary washing. He says that basically what hagiographers do in pre-modern times and what biographers do in contemporary times is like the work that museum curators do in putting together a specimen for exhibition, so that they may take a piece here and a piece there, and if they have a skeleton that they have to put on display, they'll fix it up so it looks nice, so it demonstrates the kind of historical or archaeological reality that they want to describe. But Bernard's point is that it's faked up. It's sort of jerry-rigged. You're not seeing the real piece, and so that, or the original source, you're seeing a kind of an illusory confection of elements made to look like the original Bodhidharma. I think, this is an interesting metaphor, but to me it seems, first of all, very pessimistic. The notion that modern scholars, certainly there are, apologists among our ranks. We all have individual relationships to our fields, and working with our identification with the field is something we all have to pay attention to. But to say that all historians are basically biographers or hagiographers in the pre-modern sense, I think it's overstated at the very least. I also think it's very passive. To say that a hagiographical image is one skeleton that you can stick into a glass case and people come by the museum and look at it, fails to take into account how the evolution of Bodhidharma's hagiography. I'll show you in a little bit how that hagiography evolves. And what I do is in this case, is simply a slight modification or amplification of research that a scholar named Sekiguchi Shindai did many years ago. Also in my Japanese class, I take great pleasure in confusing them as much as I possibly can. And so I went to YouTube and found a clip of the 1932, I think it is, movie of Frankenstein, where Dr. Frankenstein is finally getting his monster to come alive. Because it seems to me that a hagiographical image is not like a dead object in a case. Once you let it loose upon in a religious community, it rampages through the village, rather like Frankenstein's monster did. My Japanese students were not at all clear, I think, what I was doing, showing Frankenstein in a class on Chinese Buddhism. But in any case, I think that it's an interesting metaphor, but there are limitations to it. I think what we do have to take seriously is Bernard's suggestion that we have to consider the literary identities of the text that we use. And the problem is that in this particular case, he didn't do so himself. So that when we look at the record of the monasteries of Loyang and the continued lives of eminent monks, we see that the material that are contained in those texts is actually commensurable, and that an integrated treatment is possible. Okay. So, all of that was introduction. What I'm going to do today, first of all, is tell you the traditional story of Bodhidharma, just because it's fun. I mean, you know, I can't talk about the hagiography without presenting it first. Then I'll show you just a list of dates and tropes or motifs from the hagiography to show when each of these motifs first appeared in historical writings or in known texts. And third, I'll talk about how the image of Bodhidharma in the earliest text about it that we have, the record of the monasteries of Loyang, how it actually is a representation of a religious cultivator. Fourth, I'll talk about when the treatise on the two entrances and four practices was written. And finally, I won't present, but the goal is this comprehensive, integrated narrative of Proto-Chon. And what I've chosen to do, rather than present orally here, is give that to you in handout form. So that, you know, whenever you want to take a nap, I mean, I know it's that time after lunch, you can kind of put your head down and pretend you're reading the handout. And it's cool. I won't. If you did that in class, I'll shoot a water pistol at you or something like that. But here, I think it's probably okay. So the story of Bodhidharma, as we take it from an 11th century source, is that he was first the third son of a Brahmin ruler of the South Indian kingdom. He became a monk. He was drawn to the Mahayana. He became the 28th patriarch in succession to Shakyamuni, the historical Buddha. And then he traveled to China. When he went to China, he had a meeting with Emperor Wu, king of the Liang dynasty in South China, who was a very, very important historical figure and very important in the support of Buddhism in China, and the ordination of many monks and nuns and so forth. And so when Bodhidharma has his first meeting with Emperor Wu, the emperor asks, I've done all this good stuff. What religious merit do I get for helping Buddhism? And Bodhidharma says, none. And I think, I've actually never met a king. I don't know, what it's like talking to a king. I was within 8 feet of a Japanese princess, a month ago at an orchid show in Tokyo, but I don't think that really counts, actually. I think the emperor was really upset. He said, who the hell are you to say something like that to me? And Bodhidharma says, I don't know. Who am I? I don't know. So they didn't hit it off, so to speak. And Bodhidharma then crosses the Yangtze River on a reed. This one, most of these images I've taken from a comic book, a Taiwanese comic book on Bodhidharma by Zai Zhizhong. But this one image of Bodhidharma here was drawn by a Korean friend of mine. I kind of use it as my personal icon. So Bodhidharma went north and went to Shaolin Temple, which Professor Shahar has had a good bit to write about recently. And he spent 9 years there meditating, sitting in a cave, attracting the attention of a middle-aged practitioner named Hui Ke, who came and who was to become his successor eventually. But Hui Ke sat behind Bodhidharma, or kneeled behind him, wanting to gain the teaching from him. And Bodhidharma, he just ignored him. And Hui Ke kind of just kneeled there, waiting, and it was cold, and the different stories talk about how high the snow came up. Kind of the later the text, the higher the snow was over his body. And there's a line where Hui Ke remonstrates himself, and it's sort of some of the stories that Jan was talking about before. In the old days, practitioners, people who were seeking after enlightenment, they would do anything. They'd sacrifice their own bodies in order to gain enlightenment. And here he actually alludes to some of the Jataka stories. Why can't I do the same? Some texts actually have Bodhidharma remonstrating with Hui Ke, but others not a big deal. So Hui Ke is there long enough that finally Bodhidharma, asks him, what in the world are you doing there? Just, kneeling back there. And Huike says, I want to learn Buddhism. Teach me the secret, the heart, the secret message, the primary message of Buddhism. And Bodhidharma ignores it. So Huike realizes that he has to do something. Now, at this point, does anyone here have a large, very sharp knife? No, no knife? No. We should have ripped one off from. I actually had a student once that said, yes, I have a sword. And, she had a Tai Chi sword in class. I'm thinking, what do I do now? Anyway, so Huike takes a knife and he cuts his hand off. And he places it in front of Bodhidharma to show that he's willing to, injure his own body. He's willing to sacrifice his own bodily integrity in order to gain the right to receive the teachings. It's pretty tough, initiation fee, I think. So Bodhidharma says, well, okay, so you get to ask a question. Cut off one hand, you get one question. And Huike says, my mind is not at peace. Please pacify it for me. And Bodhidharma says, okay, bring me your mind, then I'll pacify it for you. And Huike says, but no matter how I look, the mind is not something I can find. It's not a thing that I can find and just kind of hand to you. And Bodhidharma says, there, I pacified your mind for you. If you realize that your mind is not a thing, obviously in some profound way, then you've realized the heart of Buddhism. I've never been actually real impressed with this dialogue, but that's what's there anyway. Huike had a big enlightenment experience. Obviously, I'm not Huike, and I haven't cut my hand off, so maybe that's the difference. Huike had a great enlightenment experience of that, and eventually he was recognized as Bodhidharma's successor. Later, Bodhidharma was incurring jealousy from other monks, and they kept trying to poison him, and Bodhidharma would eat the poison, and no big deal. And then finally he said, it's about time. So he takes poison and he dies. And later, somebody sees him, an ambassador coming back from India, sees him going to India with one sandal in his hand, and the ambassador comes back to China and tells him, hey, I saw Bodhidharma. They, well, you can't have seen him. He just died like 3 weeks ago. I said, no. So they open up his grave, and there's one sandal left. And this is actually a native Chinese theme of using an object. In this case, it was a sandal. In other Chinese stories, it's a sword or a piece of bamboo to simulate a corpse, and you liberate yourself by means of a corpse. So it's a very kind of Chinese, maybe we could say Taoist storyline. In any case, Huike, who then was Bodhidharma's successor, he transmitted the teachings to a monk named Sun Can. Sun Can transmitted it to Dao Xin, who transmitted it to Hongren, who transmitted it to Huineng, who we know is the sixth nature. Okay, so this is the story. And there are a number of things that we can say about it. First of all, it has great utility as a religious teaching. Okay, I think I'm not a religious teacher. I tend to want to tell a joke at every possible opportunity, which is my own kind of limitation, I guess. But if you can imagine how the story, various aspects of it, have been used over the centuries in meditation halls or in interaction between teacher and student. It's an incredibly rich variety or kind of cornucopia of spiritual modeling. In this story, this is part of what allows Chon to declare itself as Buddhism itself. Chon does not present itself as another school of Buddhism. We are one school, just like there's Tiantai and there's Huayan and Yochar and so forth. No, Chon is the tradition of Buddhism. All the rest is kind of superficial facsimiles thereof. Okay? So it has significance in that sense also. Another thing that we can say about this story is that virtually every aspect of it is fictional. Okay, I could go through almost every aspect of that story and show you when it first comes into the literature, and that it comes in so late that you just have to admit what we have here is a combined oral written tradition that's evolving over time in a very kind of rich and dynamic kind of way. Okay, change in motifs over time. And finally, if we take that, I think this is going to disappear, but the last point there was that if we take the story of Bodhidharma at any point in time, if we could take time slices of the story, each time slice would be a sort of an index to what Chan Buddhism was like at that particular point in time. So it's a very kind of rich field of study that hasn't really been exploited yet. What I want to move to now, then, is the second point, this fluidity of the Bodhidharma myth over time. So here we have, in 547, we have the first text. This is the record of the Monastery of the Loyang. Bodhidharma is said to have been from a country named Bosu in Central Asia, and he was 150 years old at that time, and it was during the period 516 to 526. In 645, the continued lives of eminent monks appears, and it describes him as a Brahmin monk from South India who arrived in China from the south at some time during the Song dynasty before 479. And in this text, it describes how Hui Ke's arm was cut off by bandits or rebels. The character Zei, or Zoku in Japanese, means kind of ruffians. And it can mean political rebels or just like thieves. So that's something we'll have to talk about. In 649, a slightly later version of Dao Xuan's, or later manuscript of Dao Xuan's lives, describes Bodhidharma as transmitting a text called the Lankavatara Sutra to Hui Ke. In 689 is the first time we get an enumeration of the patriarchal succession of the Chon, that is from Bodhidharma to Hui Ke, Sansan, Daoshin, and Hongren. And in 689 it goes on to a sixth monk, Faru, who kind of get lost in history. Around the year 700, and the date on this one is really very uncertain, we get an example of that pacification of the mind dialogue. But it doesn't involve Bodhidharma and Hui Ke. It involves Hui Ke as the teacher and some anonymous student as the questioner. Only in the year 712 is Bodhidharma identified for the first time with Shaolin Temple. In this text, which is the first, what we call lamp history, the first Chon text describing its own history, it says that Hui Ke cut his own arm off, and that earlier story about it having been cut off by rebels or bandits, that was just like wrong. Here is the first time that it's said that Bodhidharma dies voluntarily by poison, and talks about him going back to India, leaving an empty grave. Around the year 715, recently this text is maybe as late as 750, but it doesn't matter too much to us here. We get the first notion that he's the third son of a Brahmin king. And in this text is devoted to the Lankavatara as the foundation of Chan ideology, and so it has Gunabhadra, the translation of one particular version of the Lankavatara, as the first patriarch. And the Bodhidharma is the second patriarch, a radical exception in the history of Chan. Around the year 730, we get the first story of the encounter between Bodhidharma and Emperor Wu. And also the first statement, rather brief, that Hui Ke cut his own arm off. In 758, for the first time, Bodhidharma is labeled the first patriarch. And instead of the Lankavatara, he's said to have transmitted the Diamond Sutra to Hui Ke. In 801, he's described as reciting a transmission verse just before he dies. And in 952 is the first time we have in any textually datable source the pacification of the mind dialogue between Bodhidharma and Hui Ke. And if Bodhidharma died around 530, we're like 4 centuries later. In 988 is the first time that he's said explicitly to have faced the wall in meditation. Around the year 1200, there's a school in Japan, the Nihon Dharmashu, that worshipped his sharira, his relics. Now, I find this very interesting because most of the time sharira are produced by cremation. And how do you cremate someone who left a sandal in his grave? I mean, I don't know if sandals leave sharira. Well, there is a solution to this in the sense that sharira can be kind of magically or spontaneously generated by sagely behavior and so forth, but it's a little Finally, in 1224, the first reference to how we face the wall for 9 years. This is a very famous line now, kunen menpeki in Japanese, that Bodhidharma is supposed to face the wall in meditation. Now, I'd be very interested to see if Mayer can correct this if I'm wrong. What I have found, or what I found a long time ago, is the first association I could find between Shaolin Temple and martial arts is really only in the 13th century. Am I off by the centuries? Okay. And then this one may be wrong too. The first specific connection of a Bodhidharma with the martial arts is a book that came out in 1642 that he did.
That's true. 1624. Sorry for the scholarly.
No, that's okay. Well, I'm sure.
But that's
okay.
that's basically correct.
20 years I'll take.
Yeah.
So then, just so that you have a little bit of an image of what we're talking about. This is not the very earliest image of Bodhidharma, but one of the two earliest ones from the late 12th century from Yunnan. And so here we see Bodhidharma as a skinny, dark-colored monk, or dark-skinned monk, and he's holding a robe that he's about to give the Hui Ke. Now, I'm not going to show you the smaller figure standing next to him is Hui Ke. If I showed you his picture, you'd see his arm is very cleanly cut off in the other picture. This is more typical of the kind of full, final version, if we can call it final, of Bodhidharma's hagiography, with the earring and the beard and the scowl and so forth. And whether this gentleman is toothless or not, I don't know. But this is I've heard people say I don't know this from any primary source, but in the 12th, 13th century, that monks coming from India did occasionally wear earrings and so forth. So there may be they were based on Indian versions. This is the version that I'm using in my class recently. And since it's on Zen in America, I figured I had to, show, how anyway, moving right along. I said moving right along. There we go, okay. So basically so we have this hagiography that changes over time in a very richly meaningful way. How does it begin? Okay, so to begin, I want to start with the image of Bodhidharma in the record of the monasteries of Luoyang. That's actually one of three primary sources that I'm going to talk about today. So I'll take them in backwards order. I mean, I gave you the conclusion at the beginning of my talk, and so I'm kind of following this backwards, upside down kind of prioritization here. The continued biographies of eminent monks is a encyclopedia of Buddhist biography from the mid-7th century. It lists, it's meant to kind of glorify and document the glories of Buddhism. Talks about translators, exegetes, meditators, what do we have? Defenders of the Dharma, Vinaya specialists, thaumaturges, self-sacrificers, reciters, and so forth. So it's a very kind of capacious view of anything that's wonderful about Buddhism. Dao Xuan is going to put in there. It's in the tradition of biographies of eminent monks that began with a text in the early 6th century and is followed up by one in the Sung Dynasty in the 10th century. Dao Xuan, the compiler of our text, thought that he was the reincarnation of the author of the 518 text. He seems to have believed that very strongly and connected very strongly with that figure. And Bodhidharma and Hui Ke receive entries in the meditators section of the continued lives of eminent monks. And Dao Xuan, in his own essay discussing meditators in general, one of the things he does along the way is to compare Bodhidharma's teachings with that of Sangcho. He talks about them as two wings of a bird or two wheels of a cart in kind of complementary ways. The second text that we'll deal with, of course, is the only text that's attributed to Bodhidharma in kind of, I don't know quite how to say it, but it's the most closely associated with Bodhidharma from roughly the time of his life on. It's the only text that has a chance of being related to him historically. This treatise on the two entrances and the four practices. It was probably, I think, I'll argue today, it was compiled around the middle of the 6th century, although Bodhidharma died around 530. It's quoted, or the beginning of it is quoted in the 645 text in the biographies although with some changes. This treatise on the two entrances has a preface by a monk by the name of the disciple Tan Lin, and I'll talk about him a little bit after a while. There are manuscripts of this text discovered at Dunhuang. If you don't know the story of Dunhuang, I'll show a picture of the cave at Dunhuang after a while. This is a trove of documents found in Chinese Central Asia around the year 1900. So then the third text, or the first one, the one we're going to start off with, is Record of the Monasteries of Luoyang, was written in 547 or a little bit later by probably a former official by the name of Yang Xuanzhi. He went to Luoyang in 547 and probably wrote this text shortly after that visit. But Luoyang at that point was deserted. And so what Yang Xuanzhi was writing was a nostalgic description of that city in the day of its glories, when he says there were over 1,000 Buddhist temples there. And Bodhidharma is brought on stage to attest to the splendor of the most famous, most important temple of Luoyang, Yongning-si, or specifically its pagoda, actually. So where are we, actually? In 494, the Northern Wei moved its capital from the city of Datong down to Luoyang. In 534, the Northern Wei split into east and west, and the Eastern Wei capital moved to the city of Ye. And so from that point on, from 534, Luoyang becomes deserted, and in 547, Yang visits there. So here is Luoyang at the upper left, and at the lower bottom is Mount Sung, where Shaolin Temple is. So a Chinese capital city is laid out in a rectangular north-south pattern with the emperor's palace at the north, so that the blue rectangle shows where Yongning-si is in a very, very prime location, very central location. I mean, you can't have a temple down the very middle road leading to the palace, but to have it in this southwestern corner of the city is very important. In terms of Japanese Buddhism, it's basically where Tosho Daiji or Yakushiji are in terms of Nara. So a very, very important position. The pagoda at Yongning-si was fantastically beautiful, and I won't read all this. I'll let you scan as I go by. What it says about what the text says about this pagoda, and how it was its construction was accompanied by these spectacular discoveries. The image on the right is a recreation published in the Chinese archaeological journal Wenwu from a few years ago. This was in terms of the text anyway, and presumably in terms of the city, this was the most spectacular architectural monument in the city. The text claims that it was over 900 feet tall. There are other texts that claim it was only 500 feet tall, but for wooden construction, that still seems pretty big. There were bells all over it, bells hanging down, and nails in each of the doors, some kind of golden nail studs, 5,400 golden nails in the doors, with different kinds of fixtures. I mean, the description is not always, it's not always clear exactly what's going on, but it was obviously a most spectacular building. And how do we prove that this was a spectacular building? We introduce a monk from the western regions, a monk by the name of Bodhidharma, who had traveled everywhere. And he comes and he sees the golden plates at the top of Yongning's gleaming in the sun with a brilliance that pierced the clouds, and the elaborately created bells echoing to the heavens, and they claim that these bells could be heard from 10 li away, and the building could be seen from 100 li, 40 kilometers away. And Bodhidharma says, whoa, this is an incredible building. And he describes himself, says that he traveled all over, and he'd attained that age. And he says, I've been everywhere in the Buddhist world. I've never seen anything as fantastic as this. And so he stayed there at the building and basically prayed or recited Namo, Namo, Namo in adoration for several days. And the question is, was this the Bodhidharma of the Chon school? It's a serious and significant question for how we view the history, because if it is Bodhidharma, then we know a little bit more about his life. The detail that he was 150 years old is shared with other Chon sources of later, but there's no reference to meditation. The Namo, his recitation, seems simply devotional, and Bernard refers to him as a devout and somewhat senile monk. And I got to say, I'm sorry, that just rankles me. Okay, we have a East Asian tradition that very much, highly values longevity, and I don't know where Bernard is seen somewhat senile in this. Devout he certainly is, but the real point is this an image of a meditator or not? The first scholar, incidentally, to notice this reference to Bodhidharma was Paul Pelliot. And here's a picture of Paul Pelliot in the cave at Dunhuang sorting manuscripts. So Pelliot got there in 1905, 1906. Stein had already taken away quite a number of the finds, but Pelliot, who read Chinese, he was a brilliant scholar, he opened up every text there, apparently, and sorted them into piles as things that he wanted and things that he didn't want, and then shipped them back to Paris, and then went and told his friends in Beijing about the finds that he'd made in Dunhuang. And the Chinese were understandably furious that he'd ripped them off. Here's another picture of Pelliot, which I really like. Pelliot was very proud of himself, actually. He thought he was like a real stud, and I think it shows in this. But anyway, in 1923, he publishes an article on painting in China, and he describes the connection in the Loyang Chelenji with Bodhidharma. Then along comes Hu Shi, a Chinese scholar who studied at Cornell and then at Columbia, was one of the founders of the May 4th movement. Hu Shi went to Paris in 1926, Paris and London, and found documents, primarily those relating to a monk named Shenhui, whose name is there. But he also, Pelliot gave him his article from 1923. I mean, it's in Hu Shi's biography. But so Hu Shi published in 1927 his study of Bodhidharma, in which he tries to be scientific. I mean, Hu Shi was a pragmatist, wanted to resurrect what was good out of Chinese culture, used the past as a lever to push China into a different kind of future. And he used the Loyang Chelenji as I've described before. So his reasoning was that this 479 date is based on the continued lives of eminent monks. The fact that he was, even though he wasn't a meditator, Hu Shi recognized that. He uses the record of the monasteries of Loyang to show that he was in the north during that period, 516 to 26. And I think Hu Shi's style is like he wants to separate the facts, the good stuff from the bad stuff, and throw all the bad stuff away. So he actually has a line somewhere that 99% of Chon literature is fake, is fictional. And the implication with him is that just throw it away. It's not useful. And this is exactly contrary. This is where I disagree. And I say it's not that it's not true and therefore we should disregard it. That which is untrue is the most important. That is, the contents of Zen texts. We shouldn't use this kind of simple-minded journalistic criterion. Are they correct or not? But in fact, what's important is the kind of imaginative power of Chinese culture and the Chinese people. So that, where Hu Shi says 99% of Chon texts are false and therefore forget them, I think that's precisely where there are significant lies. So that for now here's where I wish I weren't repeating this so many times. I missed it. Well, that's an easy way. I'll just skip by it. So for four to say that it's just the anecdote of a senile or somewhat senile monk, a devout and somewhat senile monk, is just really sort of grates. So if we look at this text, the Loyang Chelanji, I mean, we need to, if it's presenting data to us, we need to interpret that data in terms of that text's own agenda. Okay, we need to think of that text's editorial agenda to decide how to use the data. Okay, so the author wanted to record the glories of Loyang, and in that context, Yongning So was the most central, the most spectacular building of all. So that to bring in this monk Bodhidharma, certainly Bodhidharma is used in that text as a kind of cardboard cutout character, very shallow character. But the fact that Yang Shenzhe picked him, is of real significance as to who he was. He could have picked translators and exegetes who are described in the text. He didn't. He picked this otherwise unknown meditator. Okay. So when I look at one of the issues is, how does the Loyang Chelanji, the record of the monasteries of Loyang, how does it define Buddhist cultivation? Now, we have a great tendency in Western writings, maybe modern writings all, to think of meditation that occurs, that's like something totally isolated. That is, you've got one form of Buddhist practice and everything else is devotional, it's something else. But within the Buddhist context, meditation is a part of bhavana, of self-cultivation. So that recitation is bhavana, bowing is bhavana, meditation is bhavana, acts of religious merit, acts of donation of charity are bhavana, acts of patience are bhavana. So many kinds of Buddhist actions can be taken as religious practice. And we have to look at this text to see how it defines the terms for itself. Well, there's one set of stories that defines this very clearly. It's about this monk who died, and it turned out he wasn't supposed to die, so King Yama, the king of hell, sends him back after 5 days or whatever it was, 7 days. And when he comes back to life after a week, he says, oh yeah, when I was down there in the courts of hell, hell is kind of like a judicial system, there were some other monks down there with me. And there was this guy, Zhishang, and he practiced meditation and asceticism, and so he was able to ascend to paradise, no problem. There was another monk named Dao Pin. He had recited the Mahanirvana Sutra, and so he was able to get to heaven too, no problem. They're using the term tentan. But then there was this guy, and he's known from other places in the text as an author. He wrote a text that was supposedly translated into the Sanskrit. It was so favored by Bodhi-ruchi. Translated into the Sanskrit and sent back to India. Dan Motse died. He had been a lecturer on the Mahaparinibbana and the Huayan, the flower garland. And he had a following of 1,000 people. But King Yama says, whoa, lectures on Buddhism? They're inclined to be discriminatory, they're kind of arrogant, they're intimidating. This is the most detestable behavior a monk can pursue. So now, try to meditate and chant the sutras, and maybe you'll be okay. And Tanmotse says, well, boy, ever since I became a monk, all I've done is lecturing. I don't know anything about meditating and sutra recitation. So Yama says, take him away. And 10 guys in blue, and this is kind of like, laborers' uniforms. You hear the blue-robed guys coming along, this is bad news. The blue-robed guys come along and they take him to a gate in the northwest where all the rooms were dark and they appeared unpleasant. And here's my favorite line in the place, in the text. It did not seem to be a good place. When they're describing one of the hells and they say it didn't seem to be a very good place, I think they're right. They know what they're talking about. So then there was another monk who was a fundraiser. And he said that he'd made copies of sutras, he duplicated, he made Buddha images. And Yama said, to be a monk, you have to control your mind and abide by the teaching and exert your best in meditating and chanting. You shouldn't be involved in these mundane affairs. But you made copies of sutras and you made Buddhist images, but you were really after the donations. So you were really only making yourself greedier and not liberating yourself from the 3 poisons that cause distress. So he got taken away to the Black Gate too. And then there was Bao Zhen, who said that he'd been a politician or a government official. He'd been a grand warden of the county of Longxi, before leaving home to become a monk. And he sort of brags to Yama, before I became a monk, as an official, I sponsored the construction of this temple. And then once the temple was done, I had myself ordained and I became the abbot there. And so, okay, yeah, well, if you want to be picky about it, I didn't meditate or chant sutras, but I was really good at, doing stuff for Buddhism. And Yama, really takes off on him. He says, as an official, you're just ripping off the people. You're, perverting your official status to get money for the for Buddhism. And it's not really what you did, it's all those donations that made it happen. So, off he goes to the Black Tower, too. So the Empress, and the Empress happens to be the one who built the pagoda, she had all this verified. And it was all, they went around to these monks' monasteries and found that the stories they told about the guy who came back from the dead, they told them about them, they were all true. And so after that, she had 100 monks supported in the palace, monks who were meditation practitioners. And so monks got very diligent in the practice of meditation, including the hero of the story who continued to practice meditation and so forth. So what we have here is that in this text, in the record of the monasteries of Loyang, 4 monks, superficial and kind of unbeneficial karmic acts are rejected. That is, lecturing, fundraising, copying scriptures, building monasteries. All that stuff is not the right thing for monks to do. It's not about lay people, but it's not the right thing for monks to do anyway. But for monks, 2 things are equally beneficial. One is reciting the scriptures, the other is seated meditation. Okay, so the fact that Bodhidharma was chosen to demonstrate or to attest to the glories of the pagoda of Yongning-si means that the author is picking a practitioner. And you could say, okay, all he's doing is chanting Namo. But I think that one act is enough to identify him as a practitioner in this sense, in the definition defined by the text itself. So he's the author of the text, Yang Shenjur, is specifying his own value system for monks. So we can answer the first question. Was the Bodhidharma depicted in the record of the monasteries of Loyang, the Chon figure? And I say, yes, no question about it. Same time, same name, same place. He's depicted as a memorable and important pilgrim practitioner. Yang Shenjur knew of scholars. He talks about them elsewhere in the text with some respect, but he picked this one monk. Okay. Are we with you? Are you with me? No, we're going to go on to the origin of the... yes?
I have to be brave to say that. I think that we are sitting here and doing miserable. We are bombed with a lot of data.
Yes, I have a lot of data because this is a university where we interpret data.
What's the story about the man?
I gave you the story, Yeah, well, I'll give you another story here. Okay, hang on a second. I'll have more stories. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the treatise on the 2 entrances and the 4 practices, which is the one text most closely associated with Bodhidharma. On the left, as you see, is my Professor Yanagita Seizan's translation of the text from 1969. And on the right is a very good English translation by Jeff Broughton, the Bodhidharma Anthology. I have some differences of interpretation here and there, but it's a very useful text. What we have in this, this is what I showed you before. When we actually look at the text, the entire text is something over 10,000, almost 11,000 characters long. And I divide it into 4 different sections. The first section, which is 1,200 characters or so, it has this preface by Tan Lin, the essay about the 2 entrances, and a couple of letters. It's all written in a very literary style, and this existed by 649. It may have all been written by Tan Lin. There's no way to prove that. Certainly he wrote the preface. Almost certainly he wrote the essay. He may have edited the letters. And this is where all the good stuff is. We could talk about wall contemplation. We could talk about the notion of the Buddha nature that this Chon practice is based on. But that's too much fun. I'm not going to do that today. The second section is a much longer. You can see 6,000 some odd characters of anonymous dialogues. There are almost no names here, in a very colloquial Chinese style, very context. There's no Buddha nature stuff here. It's more non-dualism, more Madhyamaka stuff. I'm talking about no mind and non-activation of the mind. Don't intentionally do anything. And some of these passages are known in later Chon anthologies and so forth. The Wuman Ba may contain one. The third section is in a similar colloquial style. It's much shorter, but it has dialogues attributed to named figures. Now, we don't always know who they are, but the names are given. And there's different kinds of repetitious style. Also Madhyamaka, also no mind. There's some similarity to the Vimalkirti in here. What am I now? Fourth section, also named explanations, not dialogues necessarily, but explanations, some well-known sayings. Okay. So here, whoops, sorry about that. So this is the preface, and you can see that a lot of the story, the third son of a great Brahmin king, he turned to the Mahayana, went to China, feeling compassionate sorrow as a result of the decline of Buddhism in China. He crossed the mountains and oceans. Now this is the place where the Shigasung Zhuan says he went in from Vietnam, basically. Well, not Vietnam, but down in that general area. This is the part in the essay on the two entrances where he talks about the essence of principle, to be enlightened to the truth on the basis of the teaching. And here, faith is very important. One is supposed to have confidence that the Buddha nature is possessed by all living beings, both enlightened and unenlightened. And that's a very important aspect of conviction in this text. The difference is only that for us unenlightened folks, we can't see our Buddha nature because we cover it up, we obscure it with all kinds of false discrimination, false sense impressions. Later texts use an image of the sun and clouds to describe that. This is also the text where, if you've heard of wall contemplation, where it occurs, this is a term that basically nobody knew what it meant, so that it becomes interpreted as sitting and facing a wall. I have some circumstantial evidence to show that it just means shamatha, meditation. But okay, so this is the kind of interesting part of the text, but as I said, I'm not going to talk about that. In the section 2, one of the colloquial sections, we get a passage attributed to Bodhidharma, this term the Tripitaka Dharma master, Sanzang Fa Shi, which we have reason to suspect refers to Bodhidharma. He has this kind of it's not inexplicable, it's just, it's a kind of early Chan statement that it has great meaning, but it also has great elasticity. When emancipated, one's awareness incorporates form. When diluted, form incorporates awareness. That kind of parallelism, switching things around, is quite common in these texts. This is very different from any of the Bodhidharmas that I've talked about so far. Somebody asks this Bodhidharma, what is the Buddha mind? And he says, when the mind is not different from form, this is suchness. When the mind cannot be changed, this is Dharma nature. When the mind is without belonging, it's called emancipation. When the mind nature is without hindrance, this is Bodhi. When the mind nature is serene, this is called Nirvana. And this is a kind of sequence that happens very often in these texts. And I apologize for whipping through these so quickly, because I think we could spend a lot of time looking at these, but we don't quite have the time. Somebody asked Master Ke, meaning Hui Ke, how do you become a sage? And Hui Ke says, the whole thing about sage and enlightened and unenlightened, it's just your own false thought. And the guy says, well, okay, so pacify my mind for me. And the answer, bring me your mind and I'll pacify it for you. And he asks again, just pacify it for me already. And he says, it's like asking a seamstress to sew you a robe. You can only, work with the cloth that's provided. I mean, I can't start to sew you an article of clothing until I have the cloth to work with. And I see an echo in this other dialogues where early texts will say, the teacher simply answers according to the student's questions. If the student doesn't have any questions, the teacher doesn't say anything. So it goes on. I think I just doubled this. Sorry about that. Sorry about that. I copied the thing. So we get more statements by Bodhidharma. None of them involve the 2 entrances and 4 practices. None of them involve wall contemplation. None of them involve the Buddha nature. They're all entirely different. And that is a feature of the latter 3 sections of the long scroll of the treatise on the 2 entrances and the 4 practices. So what we have probably is that the first section was written at least by 649, and that the other sections were written sometime later, possibly even into the 8th century, okay, sometime after 700. One of the distinguishing features of this proto-Chon material is that there are no lineage claims made. It never has any claim that this is a transmission from Shakyamuni down to Bodhidharma and from Bodhidharma on. Nothing like that. Okay, how am I doing with time? I'm going... Okay. Okay. Next issue then is, how do we get Tan Lin in there? And Tan Lin, we know, is actually a well-known historical figure, reasonably well-known. He was a brilliant young man who worked as an assistant on translation projects. And here we see that in one translation of Bodhiruchi's, he served as the bisho. That is, he was the one who received the text with the brush. Okay, so this is the most important figure, other than the foreign translation master. This is the most important native Chinese figure in a translation team. And he's doing this, as it turns out, at a very young age. He was like 20 at the time. He's a brilliant guy. We don't have his precise dates. So at exactly the same time, or pretty much the same time that Bodhidharma was outside admiring the pagoda, Tan Lin was inside working on meditation projects, translation projects. We also know that Tan Lin, he's associated with, I think, about a dozen different texts. And for quite a number of his translation projects, we have this one guy who is his sponsor, his patron. And the name is given down at the bottom, Gao Zhong Mi. All the titles would be just really yayakoshi. How do you say yayakoshi in English? Really kind of a hassle to translate, and they're not really important. This was a military figure that had very prominent position in the Wei dynasty. What we can tell about Tan Lin is that earlier he was at Luoyang, but in 541 we know he was in the city of Ye, where he translated 3 scriptures. In 542 to 43, he translated at Gao Zhong Mi's assistance, or with his assistance, 6 different scriptures. And then in 543, Gao Zhong Mi rebelled. Or at least the history books, he lost, and therefore he's called a rebel. If he'd won, he would have been, no doubt had a different fate. And Wu Lao, where this man rebelled, happens to be Hui Ke's native place. Okay, so from this set of details, if I now look at the story in the Shugao Songzhuan, in the continued lives of eminent monks, the story in the Shugao Songzhuan is that Hui Ke had his hand cut off by these ruffians. And he thought, hey, big deal. He thrust his arm into the fire, cauterized the wound, and went around on his begging round as normal. And I think that's pretty cool. That's I think that's impressive. Whereas the same thing happened to Tan Lin. He had his arm cut off by bandits. And poor Tan Lin cried and screamed the entire night. Now, I can relate. Okay. But what the issue is that the story is meant to favor Hui Ke. And to show that Hui Ke, since he was a meditator, he had control over mere superficial phenomena like physical disaster, physical pain. And Tan Lin, as a scholar or a translator, he didn't. So that in the original story, I think it's meant, or pair of stories, it's meant to favor Hui Ke. but by a kind of principle of embarrassment, the Chinese Chon tradition couldn't handle having one of their sages have his own arm cut off. It was just like extremely bad karma. So they had to come up with this other story about him cutting the arm off himself. The other part of the story is that Tanlin and Hui Ke only learned about each other's experiences by accident. That is, they're at a meal, and Hui Ke serves Tanlin some food, and Tanlin doesn't take it. And Hui Ke says, "Why don't you take the food?" And Tanlin gets kind of angry. He says, "Well, I don't have an arm. Can't you see?" And Hui Ke says, "Well, gee whiz, neither do I. What's the problem?" And so I think clearly, according to the story anyway, and I guess I'm going on shaky ground, say, taking the story as an indication of kind of historical accuracy, historical event. But by the story, they only learn about each other by accident. Now, what I notice in this is entirely exceptional in Chinese Buddhist history. There is no other monk in the Chinese Buddhist canon that I've found who has his arm cut off, or cuts his own arm off. There are stories of immolators and people who donate their bodies to the Dharma, but not to cut their hands off. Also, the Chinese penal system did not use cutting off of arms as a type of punishment. There is some evidence at exactly this time, or right around this time, that the cutting off of hands was used by non-Chinese. I can't remember if they were right now Kuchian or something. So it's possible that it happened. I think that the most reasonable hypothesis, but it's clearly based on circumstantial evidence, is that Hui Ke had already been run out of Ye at that time. He probably went home to Wulau. Tanlin was being supported by the governor of Wulau, we'll call him this Gao Zhongmi, that when Gao Zhongmi rebelled or tried to go with the Western Way forces, at somebody's hand they both were punished, or maybe they were tortured. There was monks frequently functioned as spies. Who knows? But that's probably how Tanlin came to meet Hui Ke, and it's presumably after that he heard from Hui Ke about Bodhidharma and the teaching of meditation, and it's only after that he came to write the treatise on the two entrances and the four practices. So that when the text is described as being edited by the disciple Tanlin, I've always been suspicious. Why doesn't it say Bodhidharma's disciple Tanlin? It simply says disciple Tanlin. I think he was, kind of functionally speaking, he was the student of Hui Ke. So, as a result, that section 1 of the treatise on the two entrances was composed around the 540s. So we can now answer the second question. Well, let's see, we have this one. Well, we had that one. When did Hui Ke and Tanlin have their hands cut off? In or after 543 in connection with this rebellion. And so that the text, the two entrances and the four practices, was written about 15 years, say a decade and a half after Bodhidharma died. I'm not going to talk about why Daoshan says that Bodhidharma comes in from the south. Daoshan himself favors Southern Buddhism very, very strongly. He thinks that Southern Buddhism is where the real Buddhism was. There's also a figure in the Loyang Chelanji named Bodhibhadra, who does come from the south. One thing that I've noticed is that it is extremely rare for a monk to come into South China and then go to the north. We have plenty of records of monks coming into North China and then going to the south. We have plenty of records of lay people going from the south to the north. We have only 2 or 3 or 4, before the year 700, only 2 or 3 or 4 stories of monks coming into the south and going to the north. I don't know why. I think it could be very simple that if they come in from the south, they're used to warm climates, and why go up there to the north where they have winters and you get killed a lot? So on the basis of all this, I say, first of all, it is possible to construct a plausible narrative of Proto-Chon. There are some holes in it. There are some places where we don't know exactly what happened. But it's at least, I think it's a plausible story. And that, I tried to reduce your expectations at the beginning by saying my conclusions are going to be on the order of trivial. To me, this is very significant. To you, I think it's reasonable if you say, hey, McRae, big deal. You know? Sorry about that. Bernard Faur's article was instrumental in changing the field, but I think when you take the methodology of that article and apply it back to the subject matter himself, it shows he made some mistakes. And I have to say, the thing about the devout and somewhat senile reference to Bodhidharma is unfortunate. I really think what Bernard's work seemed like it was doing was unleashing this whole kind of weaponry of methodology, if I can mix metaphors like that, onto the Chon tradition. It's really too bad that hasn't happened. And that what we can say on the basis of all this is that some of the things that look least interesting, that is, some of the material in the treatise on the 2 entrances and the 4 practices that seems most mechanical, that seems most repetitive, that seems most kind of inexplicable, because it's so different from that wall contemplation, 2 entrances material, scholars haven't looked at it before. I think it represents kind of a different vector of early Chon, and kind of the next task that I have in my research is to figure out how it all goes together. So this anyway is saying thank you for taking the time to listen, and I appreciate it.
Thank you, John, for the fascinating story and storytelling. We've seen the hagiography as a never-ending storytelling, which sometimes tells the story of the storyteller, not only of the subject. So we're a little tight in time, so we have some time for questions, remarks, comments. Please. Yes, please.
Could you explain how you think that wall contemplation is really shamatha? It was one of the most interesting things you said, but then you didn't elaborate. Right.
Somehow I have to get this off the screen now. I see. No, it's okay.
Could you repeat the...
Yeah, so the question is, why is wall contemplation shamatha? Wall contemplation, the word is bi guan, and the bi means wall. Guan is used as a translation of vipassana very often, contemplation. We have a friend, Paul Swanson, who suggests that it's a mixed transliteration and translation, that bi actually stands for vipassana as the first syllable, and guan stands for the word as a whole. Unfortunately, that character bi is not used as a transcription character, so that doesn't quite work, and the phonology is a little bit off. In a text by the founder of the Tiantai school, Zhi Yi, I found a reference to bi ding, that is wall. Ding is a word for samadhi. And then in Janran, Zhi's third generation successor, explains that as to be in meditation and kind of be cutting yourself off from, I think, the 8 winds of good and bad fortune. I mean, there's fame and calumny and all good. You cut yourself off from all that in meditation. So I think that bi ding and bi guan are very similar terms. And if you freeze yourself in wall contemplation, that doesn't imply vipassana to me. That implies shamatha. Okay. So, but I think basically the term was a very unusual term, and the Chinese at that period didn't know what it meant. And so it gets interpreted in this very graphic way of sitting and facing the wall.
It wasn't intended as literally as it then was taken.
I cannot essay upon the intentions. I mean, it's a totally it's a or how do you say that? It starts there, and there are no previous references to it. I'm surprised. It's only with now we have electronic versions of the Chinese Buddhist canon, the C beta text, and it's only through doing like a whole bunch of searches for be this and be that I found the be ding. I'm sort of surprised that no Japanese or Chinese scholar had noticed it before. But I guess we had to find something.
I wanted to ask, continuing Dan's question, there is seems to me a significant difference between the normal Zen rhetoric or whatever, at least in Suzuki or whatever, and sitting in front of a wall. And I also wonder, you mentioned that, I'm just kind of wondering about the relationship between Bodhidharma's figure, his hagiographical figure, and the teachings that we're supposed to kind of associate with his name. Also because what you said at the beginning, he's supposedly, he taught the Lankavatara Sutra. And later on, you said the Vajracchita, right? The Diamond Sutra, right? Which is very, very different. I mean, Diamond Sutra is closer to what we would call a Zen teaching. But the Lankavatara is...
Yeah, well, first of all, the association of Bodhidharma and Huike with the Lankavatara is... I don't understand it. It's even one of the... There are two very early, what we call lamp histories. That is, it's Chon school's version of its own history. And one of them is this text that is the record of the teachers and students of the Lankavatara. And it's the one that takes Gunabhadra as the first patriarch. But even in that text, there's hardly any Lankavatara Sutra kind of doctrine there. So what's the deal? I mean, Huike is described as, after he left Bodhidharma, probably he started studying the Lankavatara. So he is known in the biographies as having started a tradition of Lankavatara study. But we don't have any texts remaining from that tradition of study. We have a list of names, some of these names who studied with Huike. And the two entrances and the four practices, it occasionally quotes the Lankavatara, but never in any significant way. So the Lankavatara had some kind of sort of occult, mystical kind of special appeal at the very least. It combines kind of Buddha nature, Tathagata and Aladhyana kind of thought, and Chon ideas do that also, so that may have been a kind of congenial scriptural peg. But at the time of that record of the teachers and students of the Lankavatara, when that text says our school starts with the Lankavatara Sutra, they couldn't really document it, and B, they were kind of out of whack with what becomes the dominant Chon tradition, which says we're totally separate from all the scriptures. So there's no that's a mystery. I can't say much more than that. I can't remember the beginning of your question.
Meditation. The importance of sitting in front of the wall.
Well, I think the whole thing of sitting in front of the wall, develops out of this funny term, bi guan. And if you have the image of Bodhidharma as a wall-gazing Brahman in your head, then the early text looks really kind of elementary, or looks really kind of useless or something. But if you say, okay, that's a later development, let's look at the interest of this text in itself, then there are different things going on. And what happens, the two entrances, one of the entrances is to recognize the presence of the Buddha nature within yourself, even though it's covered over with discrimination. And those are kind of realities of different levels of importance. The way it describes it, it's the Buddha nature that's in there that's really important. It just kind of happens to be, we all mess it up with, thoughts and personality and stuff. But that's on an almost trivial level. Just have faith in the presence of the Buddha nature, and sooner or later those thoughts, the discrimination will disappear and you'll see it. So that notion of firm kind of conviction, I don't want to use the word faith here, but conviction is very important. And then the other entrance is one of, I use the term practice, but it's really activity within the world. So learning how to behave according to the Dharma in a kind of progression of situations. So that the two entrances are very important for the Chon tradition, I mean, I have a funny position that I'm arguing, actually, that the two entrances are very important, but they have no influence, right? That they're very important in indicating two basic themes or trends or vectors of the Chon tradition. One that is ends up in Dogen and Shikantaza, just sitting, and the other one that ends up in Rinzai and looking at koans. So they're very important in terms of kind of maybe even predicting. I don't know, predicting may be too strong, but they provide us with an early indication of a kind of polarity or duel, as Bernard would say, of different approaches that happen in Chon tradition, but those terms aren't really continued on in the Chon tradition, the two entrances and four practices. They're just kind of left behind. So that's why I say they're very important, but they have no influence. Anyway, I don't know.
אתה תכבד את השאלה שלי? אני מוזמן על ידי הקודם. קודם אתה ביקרת אותי, אתה לא קיבלת את זה שלי.
אולי תשאל את השאלה.
אני למדתי פה 5 שנים, כך אני בוגר המצב. So after all, Professor John, we don't know what's about the meat, the flesh. I mean, what are the teachings of this man, Bodhidharma and his friends? What's the philosophy? What is the vision? What are the ideas? What is the connection to Buddhism? We want to know about the flesh, the meat itself, not only about cut off hands, and a lot of data and years.
Well, I'm sorry, you came to the wrong place. You're shopping at the wrong store for an item that I'm not going to sell. Listen. If you're going to ask a question, if you're going to be offensive enough to, keep insisting on something. Let me answer.
What he wants, what's his philosophy? What are the ideas of him? Nobody knows. Nobody knows. You're professional students. But nobody knows from this lecture what is his ideas, the philosophy of this man. What a section of these people, what they want.
סליחה, אני אגיד לך משהו בעברית, סליחה. Allow me.
Maybe my question will be...
Wait. רק בשביל האדון, סליחה. יש פה דברים שהמרצה אמר מה שהוא יעשה, וזה לא מה שאתה מבקש, וזה במקום אחר. וזה... Please, last question.
I should like to know, can you explain this this image of Bodhidharma in mythological tradition is found in Chen Buddhism and at the same time the founder of martial arts, because evidently it says not much else.
Okay, I will defer to Meir on this in a second, but I think that the image of Bodhidharma was extremely important for the Chon school as it developed. And as the Chon school developed, they created an image of Bodhidharma that they needed. Okay? That we need to have an image of such and such a spiritual teacher as the founder of our tradition. And that kind of function of legitimation is extremely important to the Chon tradition. And as the Chon tradition evolves, it keeps making up a different version, keeps revising the version of Bodhidharma. The martial arts tradition do basically the same thing. If we didn't have Bodhidharma or someone like him associated with martial arts, then we'd just be fighting. We'd just be like, bullies and kind of gym rats or whatever. But if we have Bodhidharma as the presumed spiritual founder or kind of fountainhead of our martial arts tradition, then what we're doing is not simply fighting. What we're doing is a spiritual path. And so I think it's very important for martial arts traditions to be able to say they're doing more than simply physical education. This is not simply gym class. I think the martial arts cinema tradition then does a slightly different thing with Bodhidharma. So I look at first of all, in the Chon tradition, Meir will say that I've kind of misplaced the initial connections between martial arts and Shaolin by a couple of centuries. I'm okay with that. But I think in the beginning of the tradition, beginning of the Chon tradition, there's no emphasis on qi, for example. They simply do not talk about meditation in terms of energy. Not in the Buddhist tradition anyway, not in the Chon tradition. And I don't honestly know, I'd say probably 12th century, that kind of rhetoric starts coming in. So everything changes, and I'm totally okay with that. So I think the Chon people had to create their own image of Bodhidharma and create a new one each time. Each master has to create his own image. Each student has to create his own image. And the martial arts tradition and the martial arts cinema tradition have to create their versions as well. They're different. C'est la vie. Or vive la différence.
Well, certainly a story of image creating instead of image reporting, which is not true but important.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the reflection.